Sad news that reached us not so long after we went off the air with this show last Wednesday, when legendary motorsports broadcaster and NASCAR Hall of Famer Ken Squier passed away at the age of 88. The native of Vermont was one of NASCAR's original broadcasters from the sport's early beginnings, his voice leading the way and telling the story of NASCAR during this critical time period. There's no telling where we'd be today without Ken Squier. Ken kicked off his career at MRN, the Motor Racing Network, in the early 70s and obtained the power to draw people in with his unique voice and style. He's best known for his iconic call of that final lap of the 1979 Daytona 500, the first live flag-to-flag NASCAR race aired on television in the USA, of course, on the CBS network. That quote, of course, that everyone knows, it's painted into all of our minds. There's a fight between Cal Yarbrough and Donnie Allison. The tempers are overflowing. They're angry. They know they have lost, and what a bitter defeat. Squier went on to stay in the booth as the lead for CBS Sports until 1997 and worked as a studio host until 2000. He also contributed to NASCAR's coverage on TNN and TBS. In 2013, his contributions were widely recognized by NASCAR and the Hall of Fame with the creation of the Squier Hall Award for NASCAR Media Excellence. It was created to honor Squier and longtime voice of MRN and great friend of Ken, Barney Hall. This award recognizes members of the motorsport media who make significant contributions with their coverage of NASCAR. In 2018, Squier was inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame and honored in the greatest way possible as a true legend of the sport. Photo taken by Jared Tilton from Getty Images. Plenty of tributes have been rolling in this week, and we'll kick off with a couple here. First, from one of his co-commentators, David Hobbs, who said, Ken was the only reason I made the move from driver to TV analyst. He suggested I meet with CBS management at the end of 1965. My first broadcast was in August of 76, which led to 41 wonderful 41 years in US TV. Excuse me. I'm eternally grateful to Ken, with whom it wouldn't have been possible for such a long career. A statement from Jim France of NASCAR says, though we never sat behind the wheel of a stock car, Ken Squier contributed to the growth of NASCAR as much as any competitor. Ken was a superb storyteller, and his unmistakable voice is the soundtrack to many of NASCAR's greatest moments. His calls on TV and radio brought fans closer to the sport, and for that he was a fan favorite. Ken knew no strangers, and he will be missed by all. On behalf of the France family and all of NASCAR, I offer my condolences to the family and friends of Ken Squier. Joe, welcome to Grid Tonight, your first appearance on the year. And as I said before we went on the air, first time the two of us have been on a show together for a very long time. How significant was Ken Squier's impact on motorsports broadcasting during the early days of NASCAR's history on television?
It played a huge role, and I think a lot of folks don't realize, especially some of the newer fans of motorsports, whether it's NASCAR, F1, or any motorsport that's on live television, Ken Squier played a big reason on why it's on live television. We got to remember, back then you had 3 channels, your NBC, CBS, ABC, broadcast television. Live TV was not the norm. A lot of times for motorsports, they'll show you the short clips or in the little recaps. They'll show you the exciting crashes, tell you a little about who won the race, go to the next story. Ken Squier really was the person that said, hey, Daytona 500, this is a race y'all should be covering from flag to flag, start to finish. And this didn't just impact on only the Daytona 500, but a ton of other various motorsports disciplines where the 1979 Daytona 500, when you have that many viewers tuning in, watching this all unfold live, no script, nothing, all just right there. This is what racing's about, and Ken Squier was there to narrate everything for the fans. This played a huge role in the growth of NASCAR in other television stations saying, we want motorsports, where it's Formula One, IndyCar. It grew to American eyes and exposed motorsports to more fans. Can you imagine if that did not occur, if the 1979 Daytona 500 was just another highlight package? We've all seen the finish of the 1976 Daytona 500 when David Pearson and Richard Petty had that dramatic last lap crash Pearson crossing the finish line, but almost nobody has seen the entire race because it wasn't covered flag to flag. Ken played a huge role in getting live motorsports on television. The other thing I'll also say too, and this is something I think a lot of people forget. Remember, Ken Squier, he grew up with motorsports, covering motorsports from the short track up to NASCAR and beyond. Can you imagine if those CBS executives then said, okay, we will cover the 1979 Daytona 500 Live, but we're going to have one of our typical sportscasters that cover a stick of ball sport or a news anchor cover it that wasn't familiar with motorsports. That would change the entire history and approach to motorsports journalism. By having Ken Squier there, he set the bar high for everybody that followed him. And like David Hobbs said, it was because of Ken Squier. Ken saw the talent and what he could do to bring in motorsports to audiences. Ken ensured that people that were devoted to motorsports journalism, providing the best coverage, got the opportunities in journalism and not people unfamiliar with it. Take the sport seriously. This isn't a regional thing. This is potential for a national sport. NASCAR is definitely at where it is today, all in large part to Ken Squier.
Yeah, absolutely. I came into NASCAR in 2007, but you go back through the history and all those 70s and 80s races, Ken is all over them. Adam says, as someone who is also from New England, like Ken was, he was a legend. Called so many big races in NASCAR, so many memories. If you've got some Ken Squier memories, get them in the chat, and we'll see if we can read them out throughout the show. Thunder Road Speedway in Bar, Vermont is part of Ken Squier's history, and as you say, Joe, NASCAR, and it's a big thing to say, but NASCAR covered on television probably wouldn't be the same as we get now with all, and as you mentioned, there's so many different options in terms of your viewing now with television and streaming and whatever else. But in terms of the sport in the 70s, it just wasn't covered like it is today. You look at the NASCAR Classics YouTube channel, they're posting stuff that's half an hour or an hour for that, because that's how what the race was covered. It was highlight packages until we took it live in the end of the 70s and into the 80s, and Ken Squier was a massive part of that. Let's take a look at some more of the industry's response to the sad passing last week. Dale Jarrett said that Ken Squier was a true legend in the sport. He'll be greatly missed. What a trio that is there in the booth at Darlington a couple of years ago. James Pike of Flow Racing said, so great is Ken Squier's influence that he's not only inspired the generation directly following his, but also the next two after that. In a world where most announcers see the trees before the forest, Ken saw the forest before the trees. NASCAR on Fox lead announcer Mike Joy said someone yesterday turned one of Ken's phrases back on him, writing, whatever race broadcasting is, Ken Squier was. Dale Earnhardt Jr. said Ken Squier was there when NASCAR was introduced to the rest of the world in 1979 at that Daytona 500. I'm convinced that race would have not had its lasting impact had Ken not been our lead narrator. We still ride the wave of that momentum created on that day. Ken's words and energy were perfection on a day when NASCAR needed it. I'm forever grateful for his major role in growing stock car racing. Rest in peace. And one last one from former Cup Series racer Rick Mast, who said, when listening to Ken Squier's broadcast, two things were a fact. One, you were 100% convinced that the race was the biggest thing going on in the planet on that day. And two, you were 100% convinced the drivers were modern day gladiators, bigger than life heroes. Rest in peace. Joe, back to you. What's the most important thing that you've learned from listening to Ken Squier for all these years and will remember about him the most?
What I'll remember him the most is he had this stoic presence on the air. As Rick Mass said, if you were listening to Ken Squier, you knew this was the biggest event going on. Ken presented it as this is a big time important event. He brought the tone of each race, I feel, in a very professional manner, but kept everyone engaged. Sometimes I think we've all seen where a commentator, a sportscaster could get a little bit on the too comedic side or a little bit watered down too many of the terms for fans. Ken, he seemed to always be perfect at painting the picture. And the one thing I think a lot of people learned a lesson of, and this is something not a lot of folks talk about, Ken Squier was part of the founding of the Motor Racing Network as well, too, on radio, where you don't have the visual images to share what's going on. So he really worked hard in painting the picture for listeners. I think that's something a lot of folks have learned, especially when you get into motorsports. I know I was very privileged. Alaska Raceway Park, I was the on track announcer there. And when I knew I was going to get that opportunity, what did I do? I watched past videos of the Daytona 500, especially with Ken Squier, Ned Jarrett, when I looked at other races. But Ken Squier, that was somebody who's like, how does he paint the picture? I know this is a short track, but I want to do the best job possible because at the end, we all care about the sport. Ken brought it on such a professional level, and overall, I think that will stand out with me the most. Growing up, I still remember listening to him calling the Daytona 500, including 1994 when Sterling Marlin got his first win as a Cup Series driver at the Daytona 500. All the way up to 2000, where for the last time CBS got to cover the sport, but Ken was there at the 2001 Daytona 500 at the beginning of the race and the end of the race. I was very happy to see him at Darlington for the throwback weekends because he always just brought that element of from the past, childhood growing up, where you had the excitement of hearing him introduce the field in the starting lineup, row by row, each racers, and then calling the race. It's something very missed, but it's going to live on forever thanks to all the past broadcasts and being available online for viewers to watch. And all the lessons he shared with everybody will transcend for many generations to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would recommend, I can't remember the name of it. If Matthew Owens is watching, he put me onto this. If you've got a Spotify account, there's an MRN documentary series about the growth and how MRN got started and everything else. Lots of Ken Squier involved in that. So if you haven't checked that out, or you're a new NASCAR fan, go back and listen to those. If you've got a Spotify account, or even if you haven't, you can listen to them for free. They are excellent. A lot of Barney Hall and everything in there from the early days of MRN. The motorsports Mount Rushmore has gone with Ken Squier and now Murray Walker on it. Two legends that we've lost in the last couple of years, and all of the guys and girls here at Grid Network pass on our condolences. Rest in peace. What a legend, Ken Squier.